September 1940, Washington, D.C. The Wardman Park Hotel conference room held an audience that represented the pinnacle of American scientific achievement. Professors from MIT and Harvard, engineers from Bell Laboratories, military officers from the Army and Navy, representatives from General Electric and RCA. They had been summoned with minimal explanation, told only that a British technical mission required their immediate attention. The timing seemed absurd. Britain was fighting for survival. German bombs were falling on London nightly. The Luftwaffe owned the skies over France. U-boats were strangling Atlantic supply lines. Yet here sat a delegation of British scientists, looking exhausted from their dangerous Atlantic crossing, preparing to discuss technical matters while their homeland burned. Sir Henry Tizard, a distinguished physicist who had served as chairman of the Aeronautical Research Committee, stood before the assembled Americans. At 59 years old, he carried himself with the reserved dignity typical of British academics, but his eyes betrayed the urgency of his mission. Behind him sat a small team, Professor John Cockcroft, a nuclear physicist who would later win the Nobel Prize, Edward Bowen, a radar pioneer barely 30 years old, and several military liaison officers. On the table before Tizard sat an innocuous black metal box, roughly the size of a large hat box. It had travelled 3,000 miles across submarine-infested waters in a locked diplomatic pouch. British officials had assigned it a value exceeding that of the entire mission's other cargo combined. What the Americans didn't know was that this box contained technology so advanced it would fundamentally alter the course of the war and reshape the relationship between the two nations. Tizard began speaking in measured tones, explaining Britain's desperate situation without dramatics or emotional appeals. The Royal Air Force had won the Battle of Britain, but barely. German forces controlled Europe from Norway to Spain. The Soviet Union remained neutral, having signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. America maintained official neutrality, though President Roosevelt clearly sympathized with the British cause. Britain needed American industrial capacity desperately, but American industry needed incentive to commit resources to a nation many considered already defeated. Tizard explained that Britain possessed technologies developed during 3 years of total war, innovations born from desperation and necessity. His government had authorized him to share everything, holding nothing back. It was an unprecedented offer from one sovereign nation to another, the complete transfer of military secrets to a nation not yet in the war. The Americans listened politely, but skeptically. They knew British radar existed. American researchers had developed their own systems, bulky installations that could detect aircraft at significant ranges. They assumed British technology might be somewhat more refined given their combat experience, but fundamentally similar. Nothing prepared them for what came next. Tizard opened the black box and carefully removed a copper device roughly the size of a man's fist. It looked almost comically simple, a cylindrical metal object with cooling fins and a protruding antenna. He placed it on the table without ceremony. This, gentleman, is a cavity magnetron. It generates 10 kilowatts of microwave power at a wavelength of 10 centimeters. The room fell silent. Dr. Alfred Loomis, the millionaire physicist who had established his own private laboratory and who served as an unofficial liaison between American scientists and the military, leaned forward to examine the device. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, turning it over, studying the precision machining, the complex internal structure visible through cooling vents. He set it down carefully, as if handling something fragile beyond measure. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. This shouldn't be possible. We calculated that generating significant microwave power would require installations the size of buildings. You're telling me this thing, this piece I can hold in one hand, produces 10 kilowatts at 10 centimeters? Professor Ernest Lawrence from Berkeley, who would later lead Manhattan Project research, performed rapid calculations on a notepad. He stopped, checked his mathematics, started again. The power density you're describing exceeds our theoretical models by factors of hundreds. If this works as you claim, everything changes. Everything. Edward Bowen, the young radar specialist, explained the technical principles with an enthusiasm that even transatlantic exhaustion couldn't dampen. The cavity magnetron used resonant cavities machined into a copper block, creating a device that could generate powerful microwave pulses with unprecedented efficiency and reliability. British researchers at Birmingham University, working in secret since early 1940, had solved problems American scientists hadn't yet recognized existed. The implications cascaded through the room as scientists began grasping what this meant. Shorter wavelengths provided dramatically improved resolution. A 10-centimeter radar could distinguish individual aircraft in formation, could detect submarine periscopes, could map terrain with photographic clarity. More critically, the compact size meant radar could be fitted into aircraft, creating possibilities that had seemed like science fiction months earlier. Dr. Vannevar Bush, who would soon lead America's entire wartime research effort as head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, asked the question everyone was thinking: why are you showing this to us? Why not keep it secret and maintain your technological advantage? Tizard's response was brutally pragmatic. Because we lack the industrial capacity to produce these in the quantities needed, while simultaneously fighting for survival. We can make dozens, perhaps hundreds. You can make thousands, tens of thousands, because technology without production is merely interesting laboratory work, and we need production on a scale only America can provide. Because if we fall to Germany, this knowledge dies with us. And because we need you to understand that Britain remains a valuable ally worth supporting, that we bring more to this partnership than desperation and noble sentiments. The Americans requested a demonstration. Within days, a cavity magnetron was installed in experimental radar equipment at the Naval Research Laboratory. The results exceeded even optimistic predictions. The system could detect aircraft at 70 miles, providing precise altitude and heading information. It could distinguish between aircraft types based on radar signature. Most impressively, it could detect a submarine periscope at night in moderate seas, a capability that seemed almost magical to officers who understood the U-boat threat. Ground tests showed the system could map terrain through cloud cover and darkness, revealing roads, rivers, cities, individual buildings. Bomber crews watching the display screens understood immediately that they were witnessing the end of weather as an obstacle to strategic bombing. The technical transfer that followed over subsequent weeks represented the most comprehensive sharing of military technology in history. The British mission brought detailed plans, manufacturing specifications, test data, theoretical calculations, everything needed to replicate and improve upon British innovations. Beyond the magnetron, they shared advances in explosives, proximity fuses, jet engine designs, chemical warfare defenses, submarine detection systems, metallurgy, even early atomic research. The total package represented billions of dollars of research and development, freely given to a neutral nation. But the cavity magnetron remained the crown jewel, the technology that demonstrated Britain retained the capacity for fundamental innovation even under existential threat. American scientists, initially skeptical that war-ravaged Britain could teach them anything significant, found themselves humbled and energized. Professor Lee Dubridge, who would direct the radiation laboratory at MIT, later wrote that the magnetron revelation was the most significant moment in his scientific career, the instant when the theoretical possibilities became practical realities. The decision to share such valuable technology originated from Winston Churchill himself, working with scientific advisor Frederick Lindemann. Churchill understood that Britain faced defeat without American support, and American support required demonstrating that Britain remained a viable ally capable of contributing to eventual victory. The magnetron offered proof that British science operated at the highest levels, that partnership with Britain provided access to capabilities America couldn't quickly replicate alone. It was strategic thinking of the highest order, trading temporary advantage for long-term survival. The establishment of the radiation laboratory at MIT in October 1940 represented America's response to the British gift. Starting with the cavity magnetron as its foundation, the lab would eventually employ nearly 4,000 scientists and engineers, developing over 150 different radar systems that would equip Allied forces worldwide. The speed of American mobilization astounded the British visitors. Within months, American industry was producing magnetrons in quantities that Britain couldn't approach. Within a year, American radar systems based on the British design were being installed in ships, aircraft, and ground installations across the growing American military. The Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated the magnetron's impact most dramatically. German U-boats had developed highly effective tactics, operating on the surface at night to charge batteries and move at higher speeds, submerging during daylight to avoid aircraft detection. This pattern worked because existing radar couldn't reliably detect submarines on the surface, especially at night or in rough seas. The long wavelengths used by early radar systems scattered off waves, creating clutter that masked submarine signatures. Allied aircraft flew over German submarines without detecting them, while convoys sailed into ambushes they had no way to anticipate. Magnetron-based radar changed everything. The 10-centimeter wavelength provided resolution fine enough to distinguish submarines from sea clutter. Aircraft equipped with these new systems could detect surfaced U-boats at several miles range in conditions that rendered them invisible to visual observation. The first installations appeared on Allied aircraft in early 1941, and U-boat commanders immediately noticed a disturbing pattern. Submarines operating on the surface at night, previously safe from air attack, began getting bombed with impossible accuracy. Aircraft appeared from darkness or cloud, dropping depth charges before U-boats could crash dive to safety. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, initially suspected betrayal. He ordered investigations into whether British intelligence had broken German codes, whether spies had infiltrated submarine command, whether some new detection method existed that his technical staff hadn't anticipated. German scientists working under wartime constraints with limited resources never imagined the magnetron's capabilities. Their radar research remained focused on longer wavelengths, never achieving the breakthrough that Birmingham University researchers had accomplished. Donitz never learned the truth during the war, never understood that a device small enough to fit in his hand had shattered to the tactical advantage his submarines had enjoyed. The statistical impact was devastating for Germany. U-boat losses began climbing in 1942 and became catastrophic by 1943. Submarines that had terrorized Atlantic convoys found themselves hunted by aircraft they couldn't detect until bombs were falling. The safe darkness that had protected them became a trap. Donitz wrote in his diary that some new detection method had created a crisis in submarine warfare, that continued operations might become impossible if the losses continued. German U-boat production accelerated frantically, but replacement submarines couldn't offset losses from aircraft equipped with magnetron radar. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively. Allied shipping losses plummeted while U-boat casualties soared. Convoys that had sailed with dread, expecting to lose 10 or 20% of their ships, began arriving intact. The food, fuel, and equipment flowing from America to Britain increased dramatically, enabling Britain to survive and prepare for eventual offensive operations. The strategic bombing campaign that would devastate German industry depended entirely on this secure Atlantic supply line, made possible by the cavity magnetron. Strategic bombing demonstrated the magnetron's impact in a different but equally profound way. Before magnetron-based radar, bombing accuracy depended on visual targeting, requiring clear weather and daylight operations that exposed bombers to maximum defensive fire. Bomber Command suffered horrific losses on raids where clouds obscured targets, forcing crews to bomb estimated positions with predictable lack of accuracy. German cities often experienced raids where bombs fell miles from intended targets, landing on empty fields or residential areas far from industrial facilities. The strategic bombing campaign was failing, consuming resources and lives while achieving minimal damage to German war production. H-2S radar, powered by the cavity magnetron, transformed bombing from educated guessing to precision targeting. The system projected a radar map of the terrain below onto a cathode ray tube display, showing navigators' cities, rivers, coastlines, even individual large buildings. For the first time, bomber crews could identify targets through complete cloud cover or total darkness. Cities appeared as bright returns on the display screen, industrial areas particularly distinct due to their metal structures. Navigators could guide their aircraft to specific locations in conditions that would have made bombing impossible months earlier. The first operational use of H-2S came in January 1943 during a raid on Hamburg. German defenders, accustomed to weather providing protection from night bombing, discovered that clouds and darkness no longer guaranteed safety. British bombers arrived over Hamburg in conditions that should have prevented accurate bombing, yet their bombs fell with unprecedented precision on port facilities and industrial areas. Subsequent raids using H-2S devastated German cities regardless of weather, forcing Germany to maintain massive defensive resources protecting every potential target, since weather no longer provided natural protection. The psychological impact on German defenders was profound. Flak crews and fighter pilots had relied on weather forecasts to anticipate when they might face bomber streams, when they could rest relatively safely. The arrival of all-weather bombing capability meant constant alertness, constant strain, never knowing when bomber formations might appear overhead. German war production suffered not just from physical destruction but from the disruption of never knowing which facilities were safe, which could operate without fear of sudden devastating attack. American bombers adopted Magnetron radar with equal enthusiasm. The famous Norden bomb sight, celebrated in American propaganda as the ultimate precision instrument, worked perfectly only in ideal conditions that rarely existed over European targets. Magnetron-based radar systems provided American bomber crews the capability to find and strike targets in the weather conditions that characterized northern Europe. The combined bomber offensive, the joint British-American campaign to destroy German industrial capacity, depended absolutely on radar capabilities that the cavity magnetron enabled. Beyond submarines and bombing, the magnetron revolutionized dozens of military applications. Naval gunnery radar systems, using magnetron-generated microwaves, could track targets with accuracy impossible for optical rangefinders, allowing ships to fire effectively at night or through fog. The systems could simultaneously track multiple targets, prioritizing threats automatically, transforming naval combat from individual duels to coordinated fleet actions. Aircraft interception radar, compact enough to fit in fighter noses thanks to the magnetron's small size, allowed night fighters to hunt enemy bombers with deadly efficiency. German bomber streams that had operated with relative impunity during darkness found themselves intercepted by fighters that could detect them at several miles range, closing for kills that German crews never saw coming. Ground-based radar systems using magnetrons provided early warning networks that protected cities and military installations. The chain-home system that had served Britain during the Battle of Britain gave way to more sophisticated installations that could track aircraft at longer ranges with greater precision. These networks coordinated fighter responses, directed anti-aircraft fire, provided warning to civilians, created defensive umbrellas that made German air attacks increasingly costly and ineffective. Proximity fuses, perhaps the most ingenious application of magnetron technology, transformed anti-aircraft artillery. Traditional anti-aircraft shells required precise calculations of target altitude and speed, then timed fuses hoping the shell would explode at the correct moment near the target. The process required such precision that most shells exploded too early or too late, wasting ammunition while aircraft escaped unharmed. Proximity fuses used miniature radar systems, powered by magnetron derivatives, that detected when a shell passed near an aircraft and detonated automatically at optimal range. The impact on effectiveness was staggering, increasing the probability of killing aircraft by factors of 5 to 10. The Pacific War demonstrated magnetron radar's versatility across different operational conditions. Japanese aircraft, operating at longer ranges than European counterparts, had relied on weather and distance for protection. Magnetron radar eliminated both advantages. American ships detected incoming Japanese aircraft at unprecedented ranges, coordinating defensive responses that decimated attacking formations. The kamikaze attacks that terrorized American naval forces in 1944 and 1945 would have been catastrophically effective without radar-directed defensive fire. As it was, the combination of radar detection and proximity fuse shells destroyed the majority of kamikaze aircraft before they reached targets. Island invasions depended on magnetron-equipped radar to coordinate naval gunfire support. Bombardment ships could strike Japanese positions with precision despite smoke, rain, or darkness, providing Marines advancing on beaches with fire support that Japanese defenders couldn't counter or escape. The ability to conduct operations regardless of visibility gave American forces tempo advantages that Japanese commanders, trained in conventional warfare, couldn't match. The mass production of magnetrons represented an industrial achievement matching the technological breakthrough. British researchers had hand-built magnetrons using precision machining that required skilled craftsmen working for days on individual units. American industry, leveraging assembly line techniques and specialized tooling, reduced production time to hours while improving reliability and consistency. The Raytheon Company, which had manufactured radio tubes before the war, became the largest magnetron producer, eventually building units at rates exceeding 1,000 per day. Western Electric, Bell Labs' manufacturing arm, developed automated production techniques that reduced costs while increasing output. The scale of production reflected American industrial philosophy perfectly. British scientists had created a revolutionary technology, but could manufacture it only in small quantities. American engineers studied the device, redesigned it for mass production, created specialized tools and assembly fixtures, trained workers in new techniques, then manufactured it in quantities that Britain couldn't have approached even in peacetime. By 1944, American factories were producing more magnetrons daily than Britain had manufactured in total since the device's invention. This production capacity cascaded through the entire Allied war effort. Every radar system Britain deployed used magnetrons from American factories. Free French forces, reorganizing after liberation, equipped their aircraft and ships with American-built radar. Soviet forces, despite maintaining suspicion toward Western allies, eagerly accepted radar equipment, including magnetron-based systems. The Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, received radar technology that their own industries couldn't have produced in wartime. The magnetron became a symbol of Allied industrial cooperation, a British invention manufactured by American industry and distributed throughout the coalition. German intelligence services never fully understood what had happened. They captured Allied radar equipment, examined it, reverse-engineered components, but their scientists, working under bombing, resource shortages, and ideological constraints that limited scientific cooperation, never replicated the magnetron's capabilities. German radar remained focused on longer wavelengths, less precise, less capable, unable to match Allied systems that had leapt ahead technologically. After the war, captured German scientists expressed amazement at the magnetron's elegance and effectiveness, acknowledging that German research had pursued completely different approaches that proved inferior. The decision to share the magnetron represented one of history's most successful examples of alliance diplomacy. Churchill and his scientific advisors gambled that openly sharing Britain's most valuable technology would cement American support and demonstrate Britain's continued value as an ally. The gamble succeeded beyond expectations. American scientists and military leaders, initially skeptical, became enthusiastic advocates for supporting Britain after witnessing what British researchers had accomplished. The Magnetron proved that Britain retained world-class scientific capabilities despite enduring 2 years of desperate warfare. The establishment of joint research programs followed naturally. British and American scientists worked together developing improved radar systems, sharing theoretical advances, coordinating production requirements. The Tizard Mission's openness created trust that facilitated cooperation throughout the war. Scientists who had met during those initial demonstrations in Washington maintained correspondence, visited each other's laboratories, collaborated on problems neither nation could have solved alone. This scientific partnership extended beyond radar into atomic research, jet propulsion, code breaking, establishing patterns of cooperation that continued decades after the war ended. The personal relationships formed during this technological exchange shaped post-war science. American researchers who had worked with British colleagues during the radiation laboratory years became advocates for continued cooperation and information sharing. The tradition of open scientific exchange, temporarily interrupted by wartime secrecy requirements, resumed with participants who understood that collaboration accelerated discovery. The post-war scientific community, particularly in physics and engineering, maintained connections forged while developing radar systems based on the cavity magnetron. The strategic implications of the magnetron exchange extended beyond immediate military applications. Britain's willingness to share its most valuable technology demonstrated a level of trust and commitment that influenced American policy discussions. Isolationists who argued Britain was a lost cause found their position undermined by evidence of British technological leadership. The magnetron became a symbol used by interventionists, arguing that America's security depended on Britain's survival, that Britain offered partnership rather than charity. Roosevelt administration officials, seeking ways to increase support for Britain within political constraints, pointed to the Tizard Mission as evidence that helping Britain served American interests directly. The Lend-Lease program, enacted in March 1941, provided legal framework for massive American aid to Britain without requiring immediate payment. The magnetron and other Tizard Mission technologies influenced congressional debates preceding Lend-Lease passage. Representatives who had been briefed on the magnetron's capabilities understood they were discussing partnership with a nation that contributed significant value to the relationship, not merely charity toward desperate allies. The perception of Britain as militarily competent and technologically advanced, rather than defeated and helpless, shaped American policy toward greater engagement. The production statistics tell the story of American industrial response to British innovation. By 1943, American factories were producing 5,000 radar sets monthly, each incorporating magnetron technology. By 1944, production exceeded 10,000 monthly. Total wartime production reached approximately 100,000 radar systems of various types, from massive ship-based installations to compact airborne units. This flood of radar equipment equipped not only American forces, but supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and numerous smaller allies. The magnetron, conceived in British laboratories, manufactured in American factories, deployed globally, became the most widely distributed advanced technology of the war. The human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic, reduced dramatically by magnetron radar, remains impossible to calculate precisely but likely exceeded hundreds of thousands of lives. Merchant seamen who would have died when U-boats sank their ships survived because convoys arrived intact. British civilians who would have starved during intensified submarine blockades lived because food shipments arrived reliably. American soldiers who would have drowned when transports were torpedoed crossed the Atlantic safely because submarine threats had been suppressed. Every successful convoy represented lives saved, resources delivered, capabilities preserved that contributed to eventual Allied victory. The bombing campaign's effectiveness, enabled by all-weather radar targeting, shortened the war by destroying German industrial capacity faster than it could be rebuilt or dispersed. German war production actually peaked in 1944 despite years of strategic bombing, testament to German industrial resilience and organizational skill. Without radar-guided bombing, production would have continued climbing, providing Germany resources to prolong resistance. The war's duration, every month reduced through more effective strategic bombing, represented thousands of lives saved throughout territories Germany occupied and battlefronts where combat continued. The magnetron's indirect effects rippled through technology development in ways that extended decades beyond the war. Microwave communication systems, developed from radar research, enabled the telecommunications revolution of the late 20th century. Medical imaging technology, particularly early CAT scanners, descended directly from radar display systems developed during the war. Air traffic control radar, making modern aviation possible, used principles and often hardware derived from military systems. Even the microwave oven, found in millions of homes, originated from a magnetron engineer, noticing that radar equipment melted a chocolate bar in his pocket. The scientific careers launched or accelerated by magnetron research shaped post-war academia and industry. Young researchers who had worked on radar development during the war became leaders in physics, electrical engineering, and computer science. The radiation laboratory at MIT trained an entire generation of scientists and engineers who went on to found companies, led university departments, direct research institutions. The concentration of talent assembled to exploit the magnetron's possibilities created networks that persisted throughout professional careers, establishing Boston as a technology center that remained prominent into the 21st century. The institutional legacy of the Tizard Mission influenced how Western nations approached scientific research during the Cold War. The model of close cooperation between government, academia, and industry pioneered during radar development became standard practice for major research programs. The Manhattan Project, developing atomic weapons, adopted organizational structures tested during radiation laboratory operations. Post-war institutions like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, trace their conceptual origins to wartime research management lessons learned while developing magnetron applications. International scientific cooperation, demonstrated so successfully by the magnetron exchange, established patterns that continued despite Cold War tensions. Britain and America maintained close intelligence and research cooperation throughout the post-war period, relationships rooted in trust developed during wartime collaboration. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, linking Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, grew from wartime partnerships forged partly through shared technology development, including radar systems. The technical challenge of detecting and destroying submarines, partially solved by magnetron radar during World War II, drove continued research that shaped naval warfare throughout the Cold War. Anti-submarine warfare became a priority concern for NATO navies facing Soviet submarine fleets, employing increasingly sophisticated radar and sonar systems descended from wartime technology. The cat-and-mouse game between submarines trying to remain undetected and surface forces trying to find them continued for decades, with each generation of technology owing debts to the original magnetron breakthrough. Looking back from the perspective of 80 years, the cavity magnetron stands as perhaps the single most impactful technology transfer in military history. Britain freely gave America a technological advantage worth billions of dollars in development costs and years of research time. America responded by manufacturing the technology in quantities Britain couldn't have approached, returning radar equipment to British forces in volumes that multiplied Britain's effectiveness. The exchange symbolized the best possibilities of alliance cooperation, nations contributing their unique strengths toward common purpose. The scientists who participated in the Tizard mission, both British visitors and American hosts, understood they were witnessing history. Many kept detailed records, wrote memoirs, gave interviews decades later, emphasizing how that September 1940 meeting in Washington changed everything. The moment when Tizard opened his black box and revealed a copper cylinder that shouldn't exist by contemporary understanding, that instant when American skepticism transformed into excited comprehension, marked a turning point in the war and in scientific history. The cavity magnetron won the air war by making the skies transparent to Allied forces while leaving Axis forces blind. It won the sea war by stripping submarines of the darkness that had protected them. It shortened the land war by enabling bombing accuracy that destroyed Axis industrial capacity. Most importantly, it demonstrated that Britain retained the capacity for fundamental innovation, even while fighting for survival, proving that partnership with Britain offered America strategic advantages beyond moral satisfaction. Churchill's gamble in sharing Britain's most valuable secret succeeded completely, cementing an alliance that endured beyond the war that had necessitated it. The small copper device that left American scientists speechless in September 1940 changed warfare, changed technology, changed the relationship between nations. It was a gift born of desperation that became an investment in victory. It proved that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in hoarding advantages, but in sharing them with those who can multiply their impact. The cavity magnetron, a British invention manufactured by American industry and deployed throughout the Allied coalition, stands as monument to what partnership can achieve when nations trust each other enough to share their most valuable assets. That black box carried across the Atlantic contained more than revolutionary technology. It carried the future,